A very good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ICES-RIS online panel discussion on India-ASEAN Digital Cooperation, Identifying Opportunities and Navigating Challenges, jointly organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and Research and Information Systems for Developing Country, New Delhi, India. To commence the discussion, I would like to invite Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sevia, Director of ICES, followed by Professor Sachin Kumar Sharma, Director General of RIS, to deliver their welcome remarks. Dr. Sevia, please.
Thank you, Viganika. Professor Sachin Sharma, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I welcome you to today's online discussion entitled India-ASEAN Digital Cooperation, Identifying Opportunities and Navigating Challenges. We're pleased to partner with the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, or RIS, for this event. Digital technologies have become central to economic growth, competitiveness, and national security. Issues such as cross-border data flows, cybersecurity, digital trade, platform regulation, and artificial intelligence are no longer niche policy concerns. They are now at the heart of national and regional policy making. As technological competition intensifies, economic security concerns grow, and the global digital landscape becomes increasingly fragmented. Governments face a pressing question: how should the digital domain be governed and under what rules and standards? Against this backdrop, India-ASEAN digital cooperation is evolving beyond connectivity towards what may be described as connected intelligence. Institutional mechanisms such as the ASEAN-India Digital Work Plan, the ASEAN-India Innovation Platform and Centers of Excellence, the Joint Fund for Digital Futures, and the annual Digital Ministers meetings are laying the foundation for a more innovation-driven partnership. Regional developments are also gathering pace. ASEAN's Digital Economy Framework Agreement, with negotiations concluded in May 2026 and signing expected later this year, is poised to become the world's first region-wide digital economy agreement. At the same time, India has emerged as a global leader in digital public infrastructure through initiatives such as Aadhaar, the Unified Payment Interface, or UPI, Digi Locker, and the Open Network for Digital Commerce. Expanding the interoperability of these platforms, particularly UPI, with ASEAN economies has become an important pillar for India-ASEAN digital cooperation, offering opportunities to advance financial inclusion, digital trade, and more efficient public service delivery. Today's discussion will examine these evolving complementarities as well as the opportunities and challenges they present for governments, businesses, startups, and other digital stakeholders. It will also explore how India and ASEAN can contribute to an inclusive, secure, and trusted regional digital infrastructure while advancing their respective economic and technological interests. We're delighted to have with us a distinguished panel of experts and practitioners today, and I'm confident their insights will stimulate a rich and productive discussion. My sincere thanks to our partners RIS for their collaboration in organizing this event. We look forward to further collaboration with Professor Sachin Sharma and his team. I would also like to thank all of you for joining us online today. I wish you all a fruitful discussion and look forward to an exchange of ideas. Thank you very much.
May I now request Professor Sachin Kumar Sharma, Director General of RIS, to deliver his welcome remarks. Professor Sharma, please.
First of all, thank you. Thank you for joining this event on India-ASEAN Digital Cooperation. And we are also pleased to collaborate with the Institute of South Asian Studies for this timely discussion on the evolving space and digital space and the Digital Economy Framework Agreement. We have very good panelists today with us. And I also would like to thank Professor Iqbal Singh and also Dr. Amitendu Palit, whom I met recently at RIS. And there we discussed that how both institutions can come together and take collaborative research forward. In this context, this event is extremely important. But the question is why we are doing this event. What is the relevance of this event? It is the fact that India and ASEAN are deepening digital cooperation through the ASEAN-India Digital Work Plans, covering AI, digital public infrastructure, cybersecurity, fintech, capacity building, and information sharing. This event provides a platform to examine how this cooperation can evolve alongside ASEAN's rapidly developing digital governance architecture. Furthermore, the conclusion of negotiation on the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement presents an important opportunity for India to engage with ASEAN's emerging digital economy framework. The discussion will examine opportunity for greater interoperability while addressing differences in digital regulations and institutional capacities. The event will explore how India and ASEAN can build inclusive, secure, and trusted digital ecosystem. And just few more words that about ASEAN-India Center. Within RIS, we have this center, ASEAN-India Center, which is mainly focused on research on how we can deepen and strengthen the relationship between India and ASEAN. And this year we are doing a lot of activities, and already few events already been organized, especially on the maritime issues. And this coming months, within 2-3 months, we have other programs as well. Few things about RIS, just for information. RIS is a think tank which was established in 1983. It is, if I say in a very simple way, it is to amplify the voices of the global south, of the developing country, least developed country, and giving the southern perspective that how we can take the development agenda forward. Within RIS, we have different centers. One, the center is the ASEAN-India Center, which I already mentioned. Then we have the CMEC, which is running with the Ministry of Shipping on the maritime issues. Then another center we have FITM, which is on the traditional medicine with Ministry of Ayush. Beside this, we have another very important center, Dakshin, which was started in 2023 by Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji. And what this Dakshin is doing is to sharing the best practices of India to the global south, as well as learning from others. It's not the one way, but it's the mutual learning from the best practices. And if I look this program, India-ASEAN Digital Cooperation, this is also one of the component of, I can say, that how we can point of view, but as well as from the Dakshin point of view as well. So with this, I look forward for insightful discussions on this specific topic. And it is well known that India also had made a lot of progress on the digital solution. And this digital cooperation will play an important role when we are strengthening relation between India and ASEAN. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. I would like to now hand over the session to Dr. Pankaj Vashisht, Associate Professor and Coordinator of the ASEAN-India Center at RIS. Over to you, Dr. Vashisht.
Thank you, Ms. Singh. I hope I'm audible. It's not, again, another glitch which we faced earlier. So we are discussing here today about digital, and I think the incidents we had a couple of minutes back actually highlights that we need to do a lot when it comes to the digital connectivity. Because you people are in Singapore, we are here, and we end up having some glitches. But it's my pleasure to be a part of this panel discussion. As my DG has already mentioned, that the idea of this webinar came when the team of ISES and the National University of Singapore visited us here, and we decided that we should do something together, and we ended up focusing on digital because this is one area which holds great importance for India and ASEAN. When we talk about India and ASEAN, generally so far the discussion was ranging around trade, investment, people-to-people connectivity, cultural connect. But over the last few years, the digital aspect has become very important. We know that for last one and a half decade, digital technology has elevated almost all aspects of human life. And it is fundamentally changing the way goods are produced and delivered, services are delivered to the people. So there is no aspect of business or personal life where digital technology has not made its inroad. And these innovation and these new digital technologies are actually providing a lot of opportunities. But at the same time, there are formidable challenges. First and foremost is how we can ensure that the digital technology transformation is more inclusive. And here, I think India has been doing a great job in the form of digital public infrastructure. In India, we have put together roughly around 17 to 18 different DPI sets, which are enabling a more inclusive digital transformation. And when we look at the ASEAN side, even in ASEAN side, that particular regional economy is one of the fastest digital economy in the world. And now with DEFA coming in, they are aiming to improve it further. So there are huge opportunities and huge opportunities of mutual learning as well as doing business together in the digital domain. Both the sides have recognized this importance and have kind of identified digital cooperation as one of the priorities. If you look at the digital cooperation framework or agreement which India and ASEAN has signed, as my DG was mentioning, it focuses on artificial intelligence, digital public infrastructure, cybersecurity, capacity building, information sharing, and financial technologies. So already a lot of discussions are going on. But as I mentioned earlier, there are challenges also. There are challenges in terms of different regulations, how we can harmonize these regulations and ensure that the digital technology remains inclusive. Another aspect is that what ASEAN India can do together to ensure that we also become an important player in the development of these technologies rather than simply using the technology which is developed somewhere else. And can both regions also play important role when it comes to the formulation of regulation pertaining to governance of these digital technology. Some of these aspects are, I think, will be touched upon during the panel discussion, and we are fortunate to have 4 prominent speakers who are very well versed with the digital domain area. So I think we have roughly around an hour and 10 minutes. So, and we have 4 speakers. So maybe what we can do is we can have 15 minutes for each speaker for the initial remark, and then we can have a round of question answer session. And I would like to go by the way in the order in which the speakers are listed in the agenda. So first speaker we have Dr. Davidson. He is a professor with the University of Malaya. He holds a PhD from University of Malaya and Master in Social Science from the University of Singapore. If you look at his CV, you will find that he has published his research in leading journals. I can read out like World Development, World Economy, China Review, India Pacific Review. So there's a long list of his publication. Plus, he has also done consultancy work and delivered projects to various important international organizations, including Asian Development Bank Institute, ADBI, World Bank, and many more. So without any further ado, first I would request Professor Davidson to make his remark. So you have 15 minutes. Maybe after 13 minutes, I can give you a kind of indication that you are running towards the limit of your time. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Pankaj. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon from Kuala Lumpur to all the participants and to the organizers. A special record of thanks to ISAS Singapore and RIS India. And also a special thanks to Dr. Amitandu Palit for reaching out and giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with the other panelists of this session. I have some slides to share simply to guide my discussion, if I may. Share them. Can you see those slides? Yeah, thank you. Okay, what I'll do is I will, in this 15 minutes or so, I will speak on the rationale for India-ASEAN cooperation, which is well established. I wouldn't spend too much time on that. Why India would play an important external implementation partner for ASEAN in digital services. And then I'll move on to a brief discussion on where ASEAN and India regulatory approaches diverge. It may not be exhaustive, but I would select a few regulations. Then I'll move on to how regulatory uniformity is not practical in this context when you talk about a region engaging with a country in digital cooperation, which is quite complex in itself. So managed interoperability would be the way to go. So the third section, I will look at practical settings on which managed interoperability can be tested, one which is already established with Singapore, and I'll give a pilot case of Malaysia, India, as a potential way to go forward in digital economic cooperation, and finally give some few key takeaways on integrating both parties through digital cooperation. The links are already there, but now it's the next phase of deepening those linkages. So the rationale, coming to the rationale, we all know that the relationship is one that is quite complementary, manufacturing for services. India is at the forefront for IT services, while ASEAN is deeply integrated in the hardware. And not surprising, therefore, ASEAN maintains a surplus, consistent surplus with India in ICT goods, while the opposite holds for India. But India, on the other hand, holds a consistent surplus with ASEAN in ICT-related services. And the concentration is just in a few countries, which also tells us something that there is considerable scope to broaden participation across the remaining countries in ASEAN. Now, the DEFA is quite timely in the sense, the conclusion of the negotiations and the possible signing by year end. India could position itself as an important external implementation partner because we don't know how DEFA will move. It's actually work in progress. So implementation is very core, and I think the progress will unfold as it goes because fragmentation in regulations within ASEAN is also quite significant. A practical starting point to start off the discussion on engagement, I would like to think of ITSA, the ASEAN-India Trade in Investment Agreement. Yeah, I think that could be updated to include priority commitments as mentioned in the slide, electronic transactions, digital payments, and so on. I think it's time to update that with a digital trade protocol, but the implementation section could come under an ASEAN-India digital economic cooperation framework, which could support the implementation, because paperwork is always very good, but the actual practical cooperation starts through how you implement some of the policies that have already been identified. So the framework could move ahead with common technical standards and sector-specific pilot projects. And I will talk about this sector-specific pilot projects in a bit when I look at Malaysia-ASEAN engagement. Now, when we want to understand how this framework will pan out, this ASEAN-India Economic Digital Cooperation Framework, I think it's good to also identify some key divergences in the regulations. So allow me here to look at data governance, which I think is the most significant misalignment, as one would expect. Data underpins digital trade flows. And here I will compare DEFA. My comparisons may not be exhaustive, with section 16.1 and 16.2 of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act of India. Now, we can see section 16.1 generally permits overseas transfers of personal data unless the government restricts specified destinations. But what's important is section 16.2, which comes after that, which preserves stricter requirements imposed by other laws. So other laws can override the DPDP Act. So one example is the Reserve Bank of India's 2018 circular, which requires authorized payment system providers to store the entire data set relating to their Indian payment operations in India. Second could be on personal data transfers. The two sides also have very significant differences in mechanisms. Let's take ASEAN's voluntary model contractual clauses, MCCs. It provides a standard framework for allocating responsibilities between data exporters and recipients, but India does not recognize these clauses as automatically satisfying its domestic requirements. What does this mean? For ASEAN, an ASEAN firm using the MCCs would still need to assess the DPDP Act, relevant sectoral rules, and any additional storage on contractual obligations. So you may need separate infrastructure and compliance arrangements for both sides, India and ASEAN. The third is, very often we speak about cybersecurity. So there are also further differences in cybersecurity and platform regulations. One is India's 2022 13 directions issued under Section 70B(6). Excuse me. Excuse me. Of the IT Act, which requires, just give me a second.
I think you are muted.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the cybersecurity, India's 2022 13 directions issued under the 70B of the IT Act requires specified cyber incidents to be reported within 6 hours and relevant system logs to be retained for 180 days within India's jurisdiction. But ASEAN countries apply their own reporting, audit, and licensing arrangements. There are also various other differences in terms of investment and also national level assessments, which are different in terms of growing, in terms of governing platforms, foreign ownership, taxation, payments, and consumer protection. Now, what does this all mean for engagement between the two parties? Misalignment is not just between India and DEFA's direction, given some of those differences that we have noted. It's also between India and individual ASEAN members and also within ASEAN members. So this is not going to be an easy feat. So as mentioned earlier, I would think that managed interoperability would be the way to go. Now, ASEAN and India in that context should develop a mapping guide. What do I mean by mapping guide? For their data transfer regimes, compatible cyber incident reporting procedures, transparent platform entry requirements, and so on. And they can move towards having standard data transfer contracts and transparent and regulatory reliance or mutual recognition arrangements, something like we see for trading goods, MRAs, only for selected, I emphasize selected, privacy, cybersecurity, and technical assessments simply to reduce duplication and trade costs. Now, however, both parties would still have additional safeguards that remain mainly because of sensitive health and financial information. So it would be very selective. The safeguards would stay in place. But what is important is each party has the right to preserve their own legitimate public policy measures so that they are transparent and they're willing to be transparent to avoid any kind of disguised protectionism. If we don't allow that flexibility, what will happen is that both parties will disguise some of these differences, which will end up risking both parties moving into an area where there's an increase of digital protectionism. So digital protectionism would simply mean that there's unfair treatment of foreign to local, or there's unnecessary or excessive localization of data requirements, and so on. So these are some examples, yeah? Now, given this background, yeah, how would this managed interoperability be tested? So I would like to look at two practical cases or two practical settings. One is Singapore, which all of y'all would be completely aware about the Singapore model, and then to look at the Malaysian case. Yeah. Now, the Singapore model is interesting because they recognize the importance of institutional foundation for digital trade, but it is relevant but not sufficient. So in the India-Singapore case, Chapter 10 specifically of the agreement, although they have the India-Singapore comprehensive economic cooperation arrangement, I think that still needs to be modernized to some extent. It already addresses electronic commerce through provisions on the electronic supply of services, digital products, and so on, but it's still less comprehensive than the ASEAN DEFA. So the ASEAN DEFA is still considered much more comprehensive than this existing bilateral agreement. So you could modernize that particular chapter for it to be a building block for a greater ASEAN-India digital trade corridor. That's the first comment. The second is the existing initiatives demonstrate how interoperability can work in practice, as mentioned in the beginning, UPI, PayNow, ONDC, Proxtera, Connectivity, and Trade Trust. But what is interesting is these initiatives were not seen as separate elements. All three initiatives combined together actually connect not just payments, business discovery, especially through ONDC, Proxtera, and also documentation and financing through Trade Trust. So it's a combination of what I would say a package, yeah? And the final one is the recognition that cybersecurity cooperation is also important in this architecture with the inaugural India-Singapore Cyber Policy Dialogue that was held in October 2024. Now, what can we learn from the Singapore model is that you have the institutional foundation, but was that sufficient? No, because rules and interoperable systems will not generate commercial activity automatically. So this is where investment comes in and commercial links comes in. So it is an implementation investment approach. investment here is how much Singapore has pumped in money into key sectors in India, such as services, computer software and hardware, telecommunications, and so on. And the inflows of FDI from Singapore are quite comparable to other bigger nations. So in return, India has actually built its commercial presence in Singapore, using its financial and to use its financial and business ecosystem to access capital, professional services, and also to reach out to Southeast Asia. So it's a combination of investment, and commercial presence that actually drove this linkage, but also supported firms and infrastructure that were using UPI Pay Now, ONDC, Proxtera, and Trade Trust. So there was a synergy between investment and commercial presence with the initiatives to work through digital payments, documentation, and so on. And these investments, the second lesson that we learned, these investments were not just investments in the form of quantum, they were productive investments, something that we could learn of. Because when we think of investments, if it was just investments that involve financial intermediation or acquisitions, then there would be limited tech transfer. So the outcomes may not be tangible as expected, SME participation would be low and so on. But the investments here created productive capacity, developed skills, connected local suppliers, supported joint intellectual property and so on. So they were productive investments. So the India-Singapore experience demonstrated this implementation investment approach to actually foster digital cooperation. But one must remember that this may not be replicable to India-ASEAN-wide ASEAN-wide cooperation. We could adapt, but what's important is replication of the functional outcomes. And what are these functional outcomes? Lower cost payments, something that facilitates businesses to transact, verifiable electronic documents, trusted data transfers. So the ultimate goal is these functional outcomes that we should see. Now, would this work in the case of Malaysia? So that was quite tangible, The Malaysian case is not so because it's still at its infant stage. And here I would think enabling a framework for sector-specific partnerships matters. We have the 2011 Malaysia-India Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, or MIKICA. Now, that too could be upgraded, obviously, or modernized. And then we have the phase 1 of the UPI Duit Now. So it's still very much work in progress. There are issues. But what is important is the establishment of the Malaysian-India Digital Council. And I think this is quite important because it goes beyond dialogue, this high-level policy dialogues that always happen between G to G, to include business participation and foster commercial cooperation. So I think MIDC, Malaysia-India Digital Council, can actually work to promote and build B2B partnerships in specific projects. So one project that I'd like to actually forward here is on AI-enabled medical device software, which we call software as medical device. So these are standalone software. They are not embedded in any hardware medical device, which offers one possible pilot project for Malaysia and India. And the way we can go about this is, first, Indian firms could develop diagnostic monitoring and device management software, drawing on their software engineering expertise. And Malaysia could integrate these applications into the imaging equipment, wearable sensors, and so on. So it's still very much services manufacturing kind of linkage. Now, does it stop there? No. Investments are important at each stage during the development, testing, and commercial stage. But once the software is deployed, at the deployment stage, I think there are some good outcomes that can come out of it. And this we see in the form of creating digital services value chain, something that is missing within ASEAN, because a lot of our services, our value chains are production centric and centric to China. So it's more production networks than services value chain. So this is where I see two-way digital services, not one way, not India exporting ICT services and Malaysia providing the manufacturing capabilities, but one way to develop that is at the deployment stage, India, you need to update the softwares. So India can provide the support, algorithm updates, cloud-based analysis, remote technical support, but Malaysia could also jump in some aspect of the services in terms of regional distribution, customer training, and after-sales services. Now, the Malaysian Medical Device Authority has already started its Malaysia Medical Academy. It's a training institute to train in-house and also to train businessmen on regulatory compliance. But we can think about in-house training on how you can actually disseminate some of the technological transfer or after-sales service, how you can get the officers within MDA to look into post surveillance and so on. So I think two-way digital service value chains can be slowly started off in this aspect. And one interesting thing, if you are aware, Malaysia has actually last year launched its first regulatory sandbox. And I think sandbox is very, very interesting because in a controlled environment, you can actually look at testing AI-driven medical technologies with regulatory oversight. Now, this is always done at the national level. So I think we could think beyond and look at it at the cross-border level. So what about looking at cross-border regulatory sandbox to facilitate and develop some kind of commercialization? Yeah, and this would be very interesting. Both sides, of course, MDA will still maintain its approval. And I think in India, it's the CDSCO, I think, right? That does the approvals. The approvals are still done by the separate bodies, but at least the evidence from the sandbox can be used by both sides. So I think cross-border regulatory sandbox is important. And the last one would be post-market surveillance. I mean, Malaysia is known for having counterfeit products going through digital platforms. But when you think of software as a medical device, we don't see much of that going through. But eventually, if this is developed, I believe there could be malicious modification of some of these apps, hacking, and so on. So this is where India's support can come in to help to monitor, flag suspicious listings or misuse of registration information and coordinate takedowns and recalls, right? AI would be important in this aspect. To look into traceability and monitoring. We already have that. We have the unified device identification in Malaysia, and they have recently announced hologram labeling. It hasn't taken off. So the security features are coming on board, but traceability, recalls, monitoring, this is where India can come in a big way for post-surveillance collaboration. My last slide on regional scaling. So how, given these two examples here of testing, there is no one common model that can be applied. Practically all these higher-level dialogues and conversations will not result in tangible outcomes. They're important. They lay groundwork. But I think we need to think about pilot projects that become building blocks. So each model may be different. So I see the opportunity in India and ASEAN in establishing regional digital services value chain, something that I think can be useful, can parallel the existing goods value chain or production value chains where China plays quite a dominant role. So I think India can move in this aspect. And so we will move beyond the services manufacturing exchange. So the Malaysian case gives you an example where we can have services to services coordination. Let's say software as a medical device. I'm not saying I'm not aware of a lot of medical devices. I've just been appointed to the board, so I know some of the developments, and I see a lot of room and in growth in medical devices where we can engage India's agency. Yeah. And then the enabling elements ultimately will still be these four. So you need compatible rules. The rules will reduce any form of uncertainty. As we know, investment is largely driven by uncertainty today rather than tangible elements. Interoperability will lower transaction costs. The businesses are the ones that need to trade, instead of the countries per se, as we always tell in Trade 101. And investment is important to finance market entry. We saw that in the case of Singapore, and commercial scaling, vice versa. And ultimately, firm capabilities determine where businesses can exploit. So regulatory sandboxes and so on, and B2B exchanges and partnerships in specific pilot projects will move this forward. So bilateral cooperation through such workable models, investment implementation, specific pilot projects are a testing ground for wider adaptation, but not replication by the other ASEAN countries. Thank you so much.
Much for so nicely highlighting and summarizing the different approaches different countries are taking in this region and providing a very practical way forward. Before I invite our next panelist, I must also apologize to you. I made a mistake while introducing you earlier, so I'm so sorry for that. Yeah. So now we have our next speaker. In India, he doesn't need any introduction. He's one of the most prominent person when it comes to the digital law and these issues in India. Dr. Ajay Garg, he heads Digital Tech and Law Group at Anand Anand, and he brings expertise in technology, law, and policy. He has been a technocrat for last 25 years. With extensive experience in digital transformation and emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, data governance, and cybersecurity. He has been closely involved with the Government of India, including the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, and has contributed to technology-oriented and trade policy initiatives. A particularly relevant aspect of his experience for today's discussion is his work on international digital trade negotiation. He served as lead negotiator for digital trade chapters in several important trade negotiations. He has also represented India in major international forums, including G20, WTO, BRICS, etc. His experience, therefore, sits at an intersection of technology, regulations, and international trade. Three dimensions that are central to future of India-ASEAN digital cooperations. So over to you, sir. So maybe 20 to 15 to 20.
Thank you. So kind of you, Professor, for introducing me. But one aspect which I think all other was irrelevant is important is that I negotiated for 22 rounds in the ASEAN before India pulling out of it. So in that context, on the digital trade chapter, I understand the ASEAN geography with respect to trade. Ma'am talked about the opportunities that are available. Professor Sharma also talked about it. But let me start up before I start my slide with a small monologue. The world today is at a very difficult stage. The Pacific countries who have been traditional partners to one very strong partner in the West, namely US, with regards to digital products and digital infrastructure, has in recent times gone through a process of tariffs, pulling in and out, and it has no more remained as a trusted partner for the most valuable partners that have been there globally, and it's a recognized fact. China has been trying to enter ASEAN through the RCEP route or through many other avenues, and but in that context also, they try to do it in India also. But one thing remains very important, that when it comes to manufacturing, which is the key element which China brings to the ASEAN region, is that the value add that needs to happen in your home country in deep tech manufacturing remains low when you are dependent on countries which are dominant in nature. There, because of these two geopolitical fragmentations, India-ASEAN partnership becomes really important at this juncture. And it needs to scale up at levels which is unprecedented in history when digital trade cooperation or trade cooperation is concerned. Digital becomes the enabler for such trade cooperation. And it needs to actually ramp up its cooperation avenues to a far greater level and not just talk about few fragmented opportunities that have exist and used to exist between India and ASEAN traditionally. We are at a juncture that we can either make the global south the third important power in this fragmented geopolitical ecosystem, whether it's related to AI, whether it's related to 5G, 6G, or whether it's related to any deep tech technology, and we can be the alternate voice, a moderate alternate voice to the world. And for this, India and ASEAN are the only building blocks I can think of in this when it comes to creating this third alternate block globally. And that's why I thought that this conference, and I must congratulate you, it's a very apt movement at which we are actually organizing this, and we need to talk deeply. One important event that happened in January is to be noted that India ASEAN signed the 2026 work plan for digital cooperation. But what was important was the first time a digital future fund was created under this cooperation framework. And it becomes important if the digital cooperation has to move forward because the fund becomes the enabler. Technological progress, it's nothing but important that that technological progress is revolving, or any economic progress revolves around the future of how a country actually looks at its digital and AI space. It is a known fact, many economists have said that in the next, by 2020, 2030, 20% of the global economy will be digital in nature in one form or the other. All sectors of economy for their future progress will be hugely dependent on digital and AI. I include AI or artificial intelligence in this. We have been, India tries to showcase our prowess in the digital public infrastructure, be it our biometric identity of 1.27 million plus, or be it on the UPI or Unified Payment Interface, which has two such global examples, which fortunately or unfortunately, I find myself to be in a country which has actually initiated these, have no other parallel examples globally. Integrating more than 300 banks, more than 800 financial institutions, and 1.2, more than 1.2 digital accounts of common man into a common service, making payments and social delivery of services by the government seamless across the country is an unprecedented achievement which India has made. We have an opportunity to actually interlink these activities with India and ASEAN. It is there. It has been initiated in Singapore. Indonesia has made an agreement on this, and few other countries. But what is important that it has to be a pan ASEAN level. It can be also on a possible that we can India can help ASEAN create when they are talking about a digital framework between the 10 ASEAN countries to create a UPI type of a framework or an NPCI type of a framework within the ASEAN countries as such. And India can be an important enabler for such things. And this will actually, I remember when in 2013-14, ASEAN dreamt of a single currency across the 10 ASEAN countries, which seeing the example of EU not bringing the desired results, ASEAN countries delayed it to it. But I think the UPI type of a framework will be a good way in which people and trade connect within the ASEAN region as such, if it is a borderless trade. The second important point is the third important focus on trend problems that will have an impact on the world. That is, India-ASEAN built a partnership that will set a global trend. What we need to do is, time has gone when India and ASEAN looks at themselves as bilaterally or multilaterally. As I earlier said, that we have examples of complementaries in such a way that we can be a role model for the global south to dominate the future trade globally and provide an example where trust, resilience, cost are the building blocks of trade rather than competition and profiteering. The next thing. I've gone through this. I don't think because I don't know how these slides got mixed up. Something is happening. AI is doing something. Let me come on to the very important point that where we build our complementaries. India has a demographic advantage globally with more than 50% of its population less than 35 years of age. The largest talent pool on digital that we have globally, and that is our core strength in the 300 billion plus IT services trade, which Madam also talked about, which we champion. But what we have recently done is that India is a home to more than 1,400 to 1,600 global capability centers that are premier research facilities that the top 500 Fortune 500 companies and beyond have created inside India to create future IP and innovation in this country. And that's a very important tool that we not only use to keep thinking that we will import hardware from ASEAN and supply software or services to ASEAN. That's the way the trade has to. The future trade can be where India can be, because even the future hardware will be software intensive. And when we actually combine ourselves on IP and research development and global capability centers for some of the leading hardware manufacturing facilities in ASEAN, I'm sure the value add percentage will be far higher in these facilities, and which will be the enabler for fast economic growth in both the regions. The second important thing is when we come to and partnership around the fintech space. Singapore happens to be a very important investment hub of fintech alternate to cities like London and Frankfurt and New York, Singapore happens to be, and which actually draws a lot of strength from other ASEAN partner countries and this facility in Singapore. But looking at the way the India's gift city is evolving and India's strength on many of the non-financial fintech ecosystem, enabling small and medium enterprises, credit facilities, AI-enabled assessment systems around the financial sector, India becomes a very important gift city to Singapore fintech ecosystem. Will be a good collaboration framework for attracting investments into this region, understanding that Hong Kong no more remains as a relevant investment hub as of now. When it comes to some of the strategic themes for realization, what comes into my mind is artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, communications, and sustainability, which can be the key enablers for future cooperation. If we actually build our future beyond services and manufacturing, it can be AI, cybersecurity, quantum computing, 5G, 6G. Understanding, I'll talk about these areas, and areas of collaboration not only relates to transfer of IPs across, but it can be research and development, talent, skilling, and standards. I've seen many of the COEs, the Center for Excellence, which my ministry at that time built around in countries like Laos, Cambodia, and many others, but they were low-end capacity building exercises. What we require is that we need to be ambitious to actually collaborate on high-end capacity building efforts in these countries. Integrating the premier institutes like NUS and India's IITs into this ecosystem. Important issue is the regulations. If AI needs to be the future, if data flows are an enabler for future economy, what should be the regulations? What I saw in the RCEP that we are actually think alike when it comes to regulations on these aspects. Where for AI, we need an ethical, trusted frameworks, which we and the ASEAN country, the human in the loop in AI, how do we actually audit the harms that AI can cause? Digital inclusion becomes a very important aspect between India and ASEAN when it comes to this, looking at the divide that we as a country and you as a region have. There's a country which is in the forefront of digital economy like Singapore, but there are many other digitally struggling ASEAN partners which needs to be actually brought in at levels which make them competitive with the rest of the ASEAN partners and globally. And India can play an important enabling role because it's always that you can't do it inside. A third party or a trusted third party can make this happen much more faster. Okay, I'll go fast. When it comes to AI, we both understand that we cannot be the leaders in large language models. But we can be the biggest consumers of AI because we are the countries with largest problem statements that can be solved by AI, whether it's related to agriculture, healthcare, ma'am talked about it, logistics, finance, any other, you will require an AI agent to solve this. Humans have failed in the last 7,500 years to solve these problems, and I think technology will move. What is required is that how AI adoption becomes faster in these geographies. They do not remain as buzzwords for research or consumption of Western technology, but we develop our own solutions and consume our own solutions so that AI we do not spend but earn out of AI, and that these three aspects, research, development, regulation, talent, skilling, are what I see that we should collaborate on these aspects together. India being a hub of more than 200,000 startups with 30,000 plus on very deep tech ecosystem. So we need to collaborate on a deep tech startup to startup ecosystem between these two countries to make this happen. On a cybersecurity, we both understand that cybersecurity is the biggest challenge in the digital space. And I'm sorry to say that ma'am talked about the CERT to CERT. Only 3 of the 10 ASEAN countries have a CERT to CERT data exchange collaboration. We need to actually ramp it at the East ASEAN level instead of having a bilateral country to country agreement. That's what I feel. Quantum computing, the future of computing, and if we talk about that, India is actually going forward with more than 5 fabs in this country, and I have read about that there are a lot of fabs and data centers being established in the ASEAN region also. We need to collaborate on this. The biggest spender in the digital space has not been on healthcare and others, it is on the telecom space. We have paid heavily on the IPs that have been developed in the West and now in the East also with companies like Huawei. We need to have our own stacks, IP stacks and IP standards in the telecom space. And I think we missed out the bus till 4G. India had a 5G stack, which was not very, very relevant, but we need to have we are working deeply in the 6G stack space in India, and it will be very appropriate that we partner with the ASEAN partner countries to actually further our foray into this so that we reduce the cost of telecom infrastructure. And then what I will say is that what we need is for all this to happen or digital trade to survive is that there has to be a long-term surety and ease of doing business between the partners. There have been no agreements on cross-border data flows. We had it with the UK and EU. Now it is easier for us to actually come up with a very definitive agreement on cross-border data flows. We need to activate the paperless trading between India and ASEAN with both I know all the 10 countries have an IT Act in place and digital signatures are recognized. And we need to do this very, very early. We need to talk around AI governance frameworks and come on some sort of a common understanding on these frameworks so that we become an enabler for global South AI trade. Other areas can be when looking at the population densities and challenges that come on sustainability, circular economy, electric mobility, electric vehicles, space tech, agri-tech. On a semiconductor manufacturing, we should not only be the fabs only, we should be the IP manufacturers. Defense, which is more and more becoming digital vis-a-vis the physical infrastructures, we need to collaborate more. Autonomous stack in auto and all these. And it's very important that we actually collaborate in the future. So the whole point in this whole debate was that we should not remain conservative around talking around services trade from India and hardware coming from ASEAN countries and making us more secure and resilient as compared to it's coming from China. This is something which has to be the bottom of the pyramid. We need to bring building blocks on more value-added trade that can happen between India and ASEAN. And because we have been traditionally partners, 1/3 of Singapore is owned by Indians. Philippines has a large Indian diaspora, and many of the Indian companies actually do services trade in Philippines. So we become natural partners with each other, and we need to be more ambitious on digital future for both these organizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Apart from highlighting very sector specific and issue specific recommendation, the one thing which I find very interesting is that your focusing on mega trend. I think that's very important because how the things are shaping up, especially when it comes to the AI and its governance related issues. I think that's where ASEAN India can collaborate more to kind of create their own space. Thank you so much, sir. Now, our next panelist is Dr. Srinivas. He's a professor of practice at Institute of Development and Research in Banking Technology. Dr. Srinivas brings particularly interesting combination of experience in banking, financial regulations, compliance, and emerging digital technologies. He has held senior compliance position at institutes including Paytm, ICICI Bank, IDFC Bank, and extensive expertise in governance, risk management, digital banking, financial crime compliance, and technology regulation. His current work also looks at the intersection of financial technology, law, economics, including digital currency, distributed ledger technologies, other emerging technologies. He is also associated with Digital Currency Global Initiative involving Stanford University and International Telecom Union. Given the growing importance of digital payment, fintech, and digital currency in India-ASEAN economic cooperation, I'm sure Dr. Srinivas will bring a very valuable perspective to our discussion. Now, may I invite Mr. Dr. Srinivas to make his intervention. So, Dr. Srinivas, about 15 to 16 minutes, if you can restrict yourself, that will be great. Over to you. Thank you.
So I hope the screen is visible. 1 second. Yeah. So I hope the screen is visible now. Professor Iqbal Singh from the Institute of South Asian Studies of NUS, Professor Sachin Kumar Sharma from the RAS, and Pankaj Vashishji heading the panel today, and other panelists and dignitaries gracing the occasion. A very good afternoon to everyone. And I'm thankful to the Institute of South Asian Studies and RAS for giving me this opportunity to share some of my views on India-ASEAN digital cooperation at this timely conference. Actually, I'm really pleased to see these initiatives actually strengthening the think tank and also the opportunities for information exchange amongst the academic community between these countries. As Pankajji has mentioned, I'm a chartered accountant with 25 years of professional experience, worked in banks and fintech companies, and I take a little bit of learning from the stint that I have had in the BRICS New Development Bank as the founding member of the compliance function of the bank, and currently into my own academic and fintech consulting assignments, and also teach in various institutes like Indian School of Business, Dhirubhai Ambani School of Law, IDRBT, Institute for Development and Research in Banking Technology. The views that I'm going to express are like purely my personal views and do not represent any views of any of these institutes. Broadly, what I have done is to introduce the digital cooperation context, and then I have bucketed 3 important areas where the cooperation needs to be institutionalized. So that is the first set of the topic that I'm going to talk about. And there are areas where cooperation needs to be intensified. We have got a basic work, but we need to intensify it. And there are also certain areas where cooperation needs to be initiated. I think I'm going to put my thoughts around these 3 buckets where we can institutionalize the cooperation, where we can intensify the cooperation, and where we have to further initiate dialogue and engage in the cooperation. But before that, we all know, I think the ASEAN cooperation has got very good foundations, both from a conceptual standpoint and also from an operational standpoint. From a conceptual standpoint, things will start with ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement. And I'm glad to see that this becomes the world's first region-wide and a legally binding agreement, and it is dedicated exclusively to the digital economy governance. And we all know that it has the potential to supercharge the Southeast Asian digital market to $2 trillion by 2030. And I am particularly interested in this digital economy frameworks because they are aimed at eliminating compliance overheads. Because once we have standardized frameworks, the individual entities will not need to duplicate the compliance efforts across countries, and that itself will save around 15 to 20 billion US dollars because there is no need to follow divergent regional digital rules amongst the countries. And the focus areas in order to promote this agreement are basically cross-border interoperability, trust and security, talent mobility. And within this framework agreement, I think the ASEAN-India Digital Work Plan constitutes the foundation, which has come out with the 6th ASEAN Digital Ministers meeting. And we are also fortunate to see the live of the ASEAN-India Fund for the Digital Future. And one significant aspect of this work plan is basically to leverage certain of the Indian initiatives like the digital public infrastructure, India mission, and these are all operationalized through exchanges on capacity building, regulatory dialogue, and telecom cooperation. And last one we all know is basically the ASEAN-India Joint Statement on Advancing Digital Cooperation. This gives us more operational aspects of knowledge and governance sharing and promoting bilateral digital trade and fintech innovation between ASEAN and India, and sustainable financing for technology transformation project, and most important other themes like cybersecurity and collective network defense, and also working towards a common standard for safe and responsible AI. Now, this gives us a kind of a scope for us to operate in multitude of fields. In fact, the purpose of reciting all these things is to see the breadth of the topics that we need to cover in the depth of each topic. I think one of my previous speakers have already highlighted what extent of depth that would be required in order to operationalize this cooperation. Let us take a few examples to further amplify this point. The one I would like to mention is about the areas within the cooperation where we need to further institutionalize. We have the framework, we have the foundation, we have the operational aspects, but how do we need to institutionalize that? Because it is just one thing to have a joint statement, it is one thing to have a framework, but how do you standardize the protocols for the cross-border linkages at an operational level becomes the critical thing actually. Like one of the things that where India and ASEAN have actively started collaborating is to have common interoperability standards actually. And how does this interoperability actually work in practice? One way the interoperability works in practice is basically if you have an open source API standards, actually, the standards through which the data flow becomes easy and seamless and also do not have any regulatory restriction. One example that I can cite is in terms of the cross-border trade. Currently, when we expect the exports from India, which are food exports, if we are going to, for example, a Thailand like country, we need to produce physical phytosanitary certificates. And these certificates are important for the purpose of clearance of the consignments of export in nature. And these actually delay the agricultural exports because the certificates require physical production, physical verification, and then the continued clearance of the containers, which means that this will leave the perishable food to rot at the airports due to the manual custom checks. So one of the ways in which we can try to see the cooperation actually materializes is basically to have an open API that can remove the paper bottlenecks, and it can act as a digital bridge to verify the export health data even before the ship can arrive actually. And this can happen by linking the India's trade system directly to the ASEAN single window regional gateway. The reason why I said it is institutionalization is because we have got on one leg, either it is on the ASEAN leg or it is on the India leg, there are certain institutional arrangements that are already happening in terms of cooperation. All we need to see is to whether the rest of the other party, can they plug into this institution is the nature of the three examples that I'm going to cover here. And these RESTful API protocols can help in terms of exchange of secure e-phytosanitary certificates and container tracking numbers. And such an integration can help the custom clearance from days to under 10 minutes. And they can stop food wastage and also save traders billions of dollars. So that could be one good example where the work has already started, where we have already seen that ASEAN single window regional gateway is in practice, and we are in the process of trying to use APIs for the purpose of doing a cooperation in practice. The other one is, I think my previous speaker has mentioned about integration between the fast payment systems. But currently, each country has built up the domestic fast payment systems, and these fast payment systems also, while they are existent, cross-border transactions still require complex and also manual technical integration in a bilateral manner. One example that has been cited earlier is basically the Do It Now of Malaysia and India getting integrated on a bilateral basis, and that bilateral integration itself is a complex activity. But I think we will need to take a little step forward when we have to look into the projects of the pilot nature that are happening under the aegis of Bank for International Settlement. Instead of India trying to connect it with Malaysia Do It Now or Singapore Pay Now, for example, there is this project by the Bank for International Settlements called the Project Nexus, which is actually creating a multilateral payment gateway, which means that you need not actually do a bilateral integration with multiple countries. All you can do is that once this project network gets Nexus gets institutionalized, India's UPI can be connected to this unified network, and this will become an absolute game changer, instantly unlocking seamless real-time payments. We have seen the announcements of Project Nexus that is already operational. A CEO is being identified, and the institutional protocols being worked out under the support of the BIS. And this integration with Nexus versus any other country wanting to connect to the ASEAN's regional corridor, that integration will immediately slash the cross-border transaction fees and also the settlement time. And this will allow the users and businesses to transfer funds globally in as less than 60 seconds, because this is the fastest integration that could be possible at a regional level. So we have got on one side, again, an institution called as a Project Nexus in making. All we need to do is to see the plug that can get connected to that institution that is in making. And lastly, the similar thing, a previous example also mentioned about data localization. We all agree that the digital cooperation relies upon the data free flow with trust to move the information smoothly across the borders. But we have got strict national data localization rules. I think this has been highlighted as one of the impediments to have the cross-border data flow in a seamless manner. And I agree with this, because such kind of localization rules restrict the data flow, creating the digital borders that block the cooperations. And also it would be useful, these regulations actually force these multinational cloud companies to build expensive isolated data centers in each country instead of an effective regional network. But I think the India's DPDP Act has taken this into a very conscious note, and it is trying to fix this by allowing the data to leave the country safely under a flexible and a business-friendly system. Of course, there is gradation in terms of the type of the data we are talking here. There could be certain sensitive data, there could be certain financial payment data, but broadly the framework is basically with respect to only the negative list countries, the restriction will continue to apply. But for the countries other than this negative list countries, the cross-border data is a kind of a free flow objective. And here is where I think the ASEAN model contractual clauses can act as a kind of a standard legal templates to keep the data moving safely while respecting the local laws. But we need to also be mindful in terms of the requirements of securing a consent unconditionally, transparency of the process for which the data is getting put to use, and the accountability of the processes. So I tend to agree with the previous speaker's assertion that while an intent has been laid down, there are operational challenges with respect to the further regulatory rules that might come in the wake of the DPDP Act. The Act has given you the clearer framework, but the rules might impede. So we need to actually start discussing the actual impediments and try to see something to smoothen the process where the institutionalization can further help. So these are the three areas where there is an institutionalization effort on the one side, but we need to cross the last mile by plugging to that institutions by the other side. Then there are certain areas that I can identify where the cooperation has to be further intensified. We need to start having more dialogue, more interactions, and more capacity building and regulatory dialogues to make sure that the digital cooperation has to build a unified and a practical framework, because there are certain regulatory gaps. While the intentions are there, they are slowing down the tech integration and regional security. One good example could be digital identity interoperability. Like India's identity infrastructure, if it can get connected to the ASEAN framework, to allow the citizens to instantly verify their credentials across the borders. Basically, if somebody wants to open an account in India and the ID holder typically resides in Manila or Hanoi, for example, and if they want to open the bank account in India, instead of relying upon the paper-based identification processes, if the digital identities can be interoperable and it could be accessible through APIs, that could be a real game changer. Maybe 2 years before, 3 years before, this could have been seen as a kind of an utopian dream. But the recent news, if somebody were to follow, we already started entering into a partnership agreement between European Union and India in terms of making sure that the eIDAS is basically the Identity, Authentication and Trust Service Framework of the European Union, and India's Digital Identity Program have entered into a partnership agreements to identify what could be the interoperable standards whereby the digital identities across India and European Union could be interoperably exchanged. That framework could be a kind of a model framework for us to see whether a similar kind of a European Union equivalent valid agreement could be done within ASEAN, could be one of the things which we need to start intensification, which will now make the things reality more than a kind of a talking point, actually. That's one area in terms of the digital identity interoperability. The other one is in terms of the digital currencies regulation and integration. Here it could be a reverse thing. Instead of connecting to India, India has got a lot of activities to learn from in terms of the regulations, in terms of the digital currencies. So still India's policy direction with respect to virtual digital assets is still evolving, actually. And there are multiple aspects of the virtual digital assets in the tokenized assets and also the automated AML compliance, for example, the FATF travel rule, and also the way in which the IMF and the Financial Stability Board have articulated a roadmap to regulate the crypto exchanges, for example. So there are a lot of these activities in which ASEAN countries have already taken the lead, actually. And that lead could be a kind of a model for us to study. While we agree that the context in which these currencies and the virtual assets operate in different countries is unique to each country, and each country has its own problems to solve and also own regulatory objectives. But these experiences of the other nations in regulating tokens, in ensuring FATF travel rule compliance and making sure that there is a FIU interchange also is one area of cooperation, especially in the virtual digital asset. We need to start intensifying the cooperation. And lastly, I also talk about digital dispute resolution, because it is also an important thing, not only to start a company, but also how easily a company can get into a kind of a resolution mode, and how easily a legal issue with respect to a company vis-a-vis its stakeholders can get resolved, and how consistently these standards are going to get applied across these nations is an important aspect. In this context, we need to design a shared legal playbook to handle the corporate hack, asset freezes, and cross-border digital property dispute. The reason why I am saying is that most of you might be familiar with a recent WazirX hack that has happened. And the WazirX is basically a crypto exchange which has been involved to a kind of a cyber attack. And there were almost like USD 235 million worth of coins were got subjected to hack. But the way the courts in Singapore and the courts in India have responded, one of the courts have ruled that the people who have actually invested in those assets are creditors, which means that they have to forego a certain portion of their loss in the case of dispute resolution. Whereas courts in India have ruled out that they are customers and they have actually deposited their money as a trust in the entity, actually, and therefore they are subjected to kind of a full recovery. There is a difference in which the institutional rights or the rights against the institutions are enforced by the investors. If these rights are not consistently defined by the courts in the rulings, actually, there will be a little legal vacuum, or there could be a legal uncertainty for the investors. And this is one area where we need to be extremely clear in terms of how we can establish a specialized or a fast-tracked arbitration panels that ensure cyber disputes ruling. For example, in Singapore, how can it be made legally binding and enforceable in New Delhi, for example? Or we have to create a kind of a synchronized regional framework to freeze any kind of a compromise in nodes immediately if there is a multi-currency platform gets exploited. So we need to start working in terms of digital dispute resolution and harmonization. That will give you certainty in terms of the operations and certainty in terms of grievance redressal to the affected parties. And lastly, there are certain areas where we need to initiate the cooperation. Actually, it is not that we just have to intensify. We have got certain institutions already there. There are several areas in the domains of three critical emerging topics. One is data protection, the other one is cybersecurity, and the third one is artificial intelligence, where there is a lot of work for us to catch, and there is a lot of events like this to take place, because we need to exchange what exactly is the emerging knowledge in these domains. For example, when we talk about data protection, we all talk about data protection through what is called as an encryption technology. But there is no harmonized rule as to what constitutes a kind of a basic standards for encryption. So if a country has to really influence the companies to go for an encryption technology and start using some things like privacy enhancing technologies, so the guidance in terms of what exactly are the standards of encryption that needs to be followed, and the standards that will be considered as equivalent of the standards that the other country would also recognize. This would be an important component for maybe the interoperability of what we call as a digital signature. So unless and until we have the trust mechanism with respect to that encryption, which is not only recognized in the domestic country, but in the other country. So a digital signature encryption, for example, if you want to make it interoperable, then the standards of encryption should be like across the region and across the implementation partner like India should be consistent, and it should be known to the certification agencies, and also the people using these digital signatures would be in a position to use it in a way that these documents become acceptable evidence in the other country jurisdictions or courts actually. So that is one area where digital signature and the related encryptions, what could be the standards that legally recognizable, has to come into picture, and the dialogue has to get initiated. And the other one is basically even the encryptions are also under the threat of quantum horizon actually. So there is a expectation that the post-quantum technologies might become commercially available after 2030. So what exactly is the migration plans? It cannot be like one country proceeds in terms of the migration, the other country lags behind, and in between the trade between these two countries is get jeopardized because of the disparities in terms of the PQC migrations actually. I think it is high time that we need to start dialoguing between the regulators. In India, Reserve Bank of India has already started constituting a PQC committee, which is going to lay down a roadmap with respect to the implementation of the PQC by the banks and financial institutions. SEBI has given the preliminary guidances. The Reserve Bank of India Innovation Hub has already published a paper on what could potential post-quantum cryptography techniques look like, for example. But this needs to get harmonized not only within the country, but also need to be harmonized across the ASEAN and India to make sure that the migration to the PQC is in an orderly manner and it is consistent across the region and the implementation partners. And in a similar breadth, when we are talking about cybersecurity, one of the significant milestones that the world has seen is the United Nations Cybercrime Convention. Of course, India is still to sign the convention because of certain clauses in respect of which it is still trying to negotiate. But beyond the convention, there is an important dependency between India and the ASEAN, especially when it comes to the scam lands that are normally situated in the locations like the Golden Triangle, where there is an information exchange that needs to be happening between the law enforcement agencies, and also the swiftness with which the digital crime-related information requests are processed by the other countries. We need to work in terms of an implementation plan to make sure that the payment systems are safe, reliable, and trustworthy. And lastly, with respect to the artificial intelligence, which is going to be the game changer, we need to have a cooperation that involves harmonizing certain rules. Each area is an emerging area, like how generative AI is going to raise copyright issues and also intellectual property issues. And how do we make sure that the content liability on the platforms is uniformly enforced across these platforms? Because one platform operating in the other country. So how are we making sure that the content liabilities are consistently subjected to a digital cross-border regulation? And also, how do we curb a monopolistic market manipulation? How do you make sure that these digital services are subjected to market and antitrust regulations, for example? So all these things require still a deep amount of the dialogue, which will ensure fair competition. It also helps protecting the creators because these are the MSMEs, are the individual retail customers, and also helps in managing the AI risk in the Indo-Pacific markets. So these are the three different examples that I have. One in terms of institutionalizing some of the initiatives that are already happening. Some we have to intensify because we know that the framework is not going to sustain for long. And the third one is the emerging areas in respect of which the cooperation has to get initiated. So lastly, with respect to what could be the challenges in this path of intensification or institutionalization or initiation, there are three major challenges. One could be the regulatory fragmentation, which is what is highlighted by the previous speaker, and also the solution with respect to the flexible sandboxes. I can only add to that point by referencing to one initiative that I always like is the Monetary Authority of the Singapore and the International Financial Corporation have come out with a ASEAN sandbox actually, so that one country's entity, if it is coming out with a regulatory if it is coming out with a project, it can get tested for the entire ASEAN region market layout. And as was mentioned by the previous speaker, it need not necessarily be that once it passes the sandbox, it is a kind of a gate pass to commercialize. But at least it will give a kind of a sound idea in terms of what this new technology is all about to the other countries' regulators. So MAS IFC equivalent regulatory sandbox, which is a regional sandbox, if it could be extended to Indian startups as well, for example. Or in the other hand, RBI also comes out with hackathons and the regulatory sandbox proposals. So that could be extended to the ASEAN players so that the cross-border regulatory sandbox permissions can be given so that the firms can start testing their innovations in a good, safe environment and then develop the dialogue with the regulators. The other one is in terms of the infrastructure disparities and the targeted upskilling. And there is, first of all, while India seems to be a kind of a single country, we all know that it is a federation of states. Again, it is a federation of people with different skill sets, with the different native languages, with different stages of economic growth. So the integration is actually has to happen on the backdrop of infrastructure disparity. There is a policy disparity. There is an infrastructure disparity because the standards itself are not very clear. And there is a technical disparity in terms of, say, for example, the way India's digital identity has been crystallized so far is a centralized ID repository. It is not a decentralized ID. But on the other hand, European Union has created the ID and a decentralized concept. But I think the previous speaker has actually nailed it down to say that it is not that we have to change the technical architectures outright for the purpose of cooperation. But how do you make these architectures, even though they are disparate, will be able to talk to each other in terms of interoperability is the kind of dialogue that we need to have in the forums like this. And I think RIS and ISAS would be best suited in terms of creating these kind of good dialogue with good technical experts in terms of making sure that these disparities do not come in the wake of cooperation. And lastly, everything deals with money and finance actually, because all these require huge investment of the public funding, and the public funding is always a scarce commodity. So what is more important is a kind of a blended finance so that the agreements like ASEAN-India Digital Fund could actually lead the way in terms of identifying the priority areas and then give the leverage in terms of the initial seed fund so that the private investment towards those areas get attracted. So what is the model in which this encouragement, because in the countries individually we are seeing these public-private partnerships, and also the lead fund investments by the national government can lead to a mobilization of the private fund actually. So how does that can happen in the context of a regional project is something that we need to start looking into so that the blended financial model can combine the ASEAN-India Digital Fund with also the private venture capital and also the multilateral development bank loans, to what extent we can leverage for this enhancement of this digital cooperation. This is one area to think it through further. So I think broadly, this is what I have as an idea in terms of some of the examples with respect to where we can intensify the cooperation. and some challenges that would come in the wake of it. And with a hope that this is one of such initial meetings where we are going to discuss this, but as the situation demands, maybe we need to have multitude of these kind of discussions. Of course, also engaging the private players, innovators, and also the regulators at various levels, so that we have not only the frameworks, we have not only the agreements, we have not only the declaration, but there is an actionable point and measurable KPIs for us to monitor going forward. That's my hope. And with this, broadly, I'll end my remarks here. Thank you so much.
Areas which needs immediate attention, and at the same time you have been you have very nicely highlighted what kind of challenges we are facing and what kind of policy approach we need to take. Now we have our final speaker of today's session, Dr. Sandeep Bhardwaj. He is research fellow at Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. He is a scholar of contemporary and modern South Asia, specializing in current and historical issues related to Indian foreign policy, Indian economic relations, India-Southeast Asia relations, and politico-economic order in Indo-Pacific. Dr. Bhardwaj was visiting faculty at International Relations Department of Ashoka University, India. He holds a PhD in International History from Ashoka University and master degree from University of Chicago, United States. He is a Fulbright scholar. He has worked for a decade as a foreign policy researcher in several Indian think tanks, particularly CPR, Center for Policy Research. He was part of editorial team of Official History of Kargil War for Indian Ministry of Defense, and he has published several articles. So may I request Dr. Bhardwaj to take the floor, and I request you to restrict your intervention to 15 minutes, 16 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I know that I needed the longest introduction because I'm actually the least impressive of all the speakers here. So nobody else needed an introduction, but I certainly do. I'm so glad to be speaking to RIS again. We had a chance to engage in December when I workshopped my work on India-Thailand relations there, and I'm really grateful for the feedback I got last time. The previous three speakers bring deep technical expertise. I work on foreign policy, so I definitely do not bring that. But I thought that one way that I can complement what was being discussed here is because I focus more on diplomatic side, is that while everybody looked at what can be done and what is the future and what has the potential, I thought a little bit of discussion about what has been done so far, right? I mean, looking back a little bit, that would be useful. I unfortunately did not prepare a PPT, but that would also hopefully keep me very short. So I'll try to end it even less than 15 minutes. I speak a little bit for a few minutes about what India and ASEAN are doing on the digital front. And then I would like to discuss where the cooperation is falling short, what they're not doing, what they could be doing. So if you look at the ASEAN-India Joint Statement on Advancing Digital Transformation, which was signed in Laos in 2024, I think, which is the basic bedrock document of this relationship, you can see that it talks about several themes like cybersecurity and AI, but they are, to a certain degree, that all cooperation is nascent so far. It hasn't really been fleshed out into concrete outcomes. The real three pillars, as I see it, of the cooperation as of now, as they stand today, are the promotion of DPI, which is what Professor Vashish started with, the cross-border digital payment, which is another success story, and the capacity building, right? These are the three where constantly we see diplomats and the governments actually putting in energy and coming out with concrete outcomes. So the promotion of DPI is a very well-established story. I'll just very quickly say that the latest example of that was something that was highlighted last month when Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in Indonesia, and there was this conversation about how the ION Indonesian Open Network was based on Indian ONDC, which is actually a pretty interesting idea in the sense of trying to create some kind of a decentralized open e-commerce model where, just like UPI, where you are not logged into a vendor, but you can use one vendor and you can pay somewhere else. Similarly, with e-commerce, you will be able to not get logged into single platform, but basically be able to have cross-platform functionality. Although, I mean, as of now, I understand that the project has not so far been competitive as compared to, say, Amazon or Flipkart or various other platforms, but it is getting there. But it is a great example of how some DPI can be exported from India into various parts of Southeast Asia, ASEAN. This has clearly geopolitical value, especially when India provides itself as a third option to American and Western models and the Chinese models, which both come with a lot of political baggage, with a lot of security issues, and increasingly now a lot of economic pressure as well, right? Which we see all the time, that if you get logged into certain technologies, then you are also susceptible to all sorts of economic pressures. The other is also that Indian options are usually very cheap compared to others. And I think that from an Indian perspective is also useful because a lot of these technologies also bring with them companies which have Indian companies which have experience with these technologies, and they can then get some kind of market advantage, at least theoretically, in various parts of Southeast Asia when they're promoting this DPI. So, for example, ONDC is also, there are several Indian startups which are engaged with ONDC and would have that experience that they can now translate to Indonesia. The other is the cross-border digital payment. We already have cross-border digital payment in Singapore, India, and Cambodia, India, and there's work on Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. As far as I understand, this is still work in progress. And what Mr. Yana Mandra already mentioned, there's the Project Nexus, which is a minilateral within ASEAN, which is trying to create a multilateral way of connecting all the digital payments together. I think it's comprised of Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and India, which is very interesting that India is the only summit partner from outside ASEAN which is already engaged. There's a first mover advantage that India has on this. Although when we are talking about these kind of multilateral payment projects, I now worry, given the American expressed animosity or a certain degree of hostility to these kind of projects, I don't know what is the politics going to look like in the future about this. We have already seen that the push from MasterCard and Visa has led to a lot of debate about UPI and how much it costs in India recently. So the politics of this may be changing a little bit. But the cross-digital payment, I think that it is one of the best win-win situation in the sense that it is great for Southeast Asian countries because of tourism. It's a great way of making money on tourism. And on Indian side, it is very great for remittance payments. There is the promise of SME trade through it, although I'm not sure if that digital payment alone can help with the SME trade, given that there are all sorts of other regulatory aspects that come with it. But certainly from a tourism and from a remittance perspective, it is a great boon. And the third part, which is very small, which is the capacity building aspect, which is one of the oldest aspects of India ASEAN digital cooperation, which has been something that has been discussed from 1990s. And there are plenty of various schemes that go on now. The most recent one is the IIT doctoral program that has started now in India, in which they give exclusive access to PhD students from ASEAN, which is a new plan. But I would like to flag that, there was a moment in late 2000s, in fact, when the ambition of the capacity building was actually much higher, when there was a conversation about even India opening centers in CLMV countries. And that has sort of fizzled out a little bit. Although there are these ideas of IITs now opening campuses in various parts of Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. But, that old idea of capacity building in the sense is to a certain degree narrowed. This is combined with the bilateral stuff that we've already talked about. So I won't talk about it. Professor Devdasan already mentioned the trust now, the trade trust program which has been going on between Singapore and India, which is a pretty interesting program anchored between DBS and ICICI, and several other similar programs which are operating on a bilateral level, but not on an ASEAN level. So to repeat, I think that the ASEAN agenda as of now is hovering around the three pillars. There is a lot of promise and a lot of discussion, but the three main concrete pillars are the DPI, the digital payments, and the capacity building. And so let me just flip that and to say where is the cooperation falling down a little bit. And I think that there are 4 points that I would like to make. One is that I think that Indian agenda has become very narrow. If we see because we have to remember that India was seen as an IT powerhouse even back in the 1990s and early 2000s. So from an ASEAN perspective, there was a lot of interest in actually engaging India and trying to gain out of digital cooperation with India. And so if you look at the plan of action that India and ASEAN signed in early 2000s, they are so large and so ambitious. And you see over the years, as every 5 years, there's a new plan of action, that the digital section in that plan of action actually keeps getting narrower and narrower till the time when it has actually become just 2 paragraphs or 1 paragraph now. So there is that narrowing of this project that is happening. This is not just on India ASEAN level, this is also happening on bilateral level. So if you look at, say, for example, the India-Thailand IT agreement that was signed way back in 2001, you see so much ambition in that. You see ideas like not just about the complementarity that Dr. Garg was talking about, which was harnessing the hardware-software complementarity, but also stuff like there was this idea of joint startup incubation. There was the idea of India and Thailand together working to explore third country markets. There was the idea of trying to find talent incubators in both countries, right? So there was a lot of much more ambition that has sort of fallen by the wayside to a certain degree. It's not, I wouldn't say that it's India's fault or ASEAN's fault. There's collectively a slowing down of momentum. That momentum brings me to the second point, that while that narrowing of that agenda has happened, and India has also to a certain degree lost the lead it had, because it was one of the first countries which has the digital agenda with ASEAN, which has now sort of lost lead, not just in terms of what intra-ASEAN is happening, right? Because this DEFA didn't come out of nowhere. It has been 10 years in the making. There have been a lot of roadmaps. In the last 5-year roadmap alone, there were 82 projects that were implemented before DEFA arrived, right? So there is that intra-ASEAN cooperation on digital, which is taking off and diverging from India-ASEAN thing. But also, if you see other summit partners, so for example, China, ASEAN, if you see the FTA that China and ASEAN upgraded into last year, into the 3.0 FTA, that has a whole chapter on digital trade, right? So it is that other countries are now taking lead over the India-ASEAN agenda that used to exist. And I would suspect that a lot of it has to do with ITIGA. ITIGA is something which has been a source of friction between India and ASEAN. And I think that friction kind of spills over into all sorts of other aspects. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the actual legal instruments which are facilitating digital trade between India and ASEAN, they would still be ITIGA of 2009 and the Services Trade Agreement of 2014, right? Which the Services Trade Agreement doesn't even have anything to do with digital. It doesn't even mention anything digital. So it is something which requires deeply urgent refurbishing, which is kind of falling behind while other summit partners are expanding their engagement on digital front with ASEAN. The third point that I would like to make is that the digital aspect is only one part of the puzzle. Because at the end of the day, if you look at a lot of discussion that is happening on digitalization, digital integration, it's not just about digitally delivered services or about data flows. It's about how can we use digital technologies to facilitate merchandise trade. So much of it is about paperless trading, e-invoicing, signatures, stuff like that, right? And if you talk about that, then the other aspect of merchandise trade has to come into picture. So it can't be just digital cooperation in vacuum. It has to be also complemented to conversation about tariffs, about regulatory compliance, about paperwork, and all the transaction costs that come into goods moving from India to ASEAN and ASEAN to India, right? So that part, which is something which remains, once again, I think with the ITIGA review debates, remains something which is contentious, is also something which has to be seen as a part of the digital conversation. It can't be something which can exist in a vacuum. And the fourth and the final point I would make here is that the one important aspect of, if we just look at the digital trade between India and ASEAN, one thing that we have to notice is that it lacks diversification. 10% of India's digital services trade is with ASEAN countries, but 2/3 of that is with Singapore, right? One country basically keeps an oversized part of the entire digital trade between India and ASEAN. And that's, I think, a problem for both, even India and Singapore. For both their interest, I think it would be better if India's digital trade is diversified with other countries. And also it should be also thought of not diversification just in that front, but also in terms of that the services trade overall. On that, the digital trade, which is basically the ICT services and the professional services, let's just throw in the consultancy service and all that, where India has advantage, is basically balanced by the advantage that Southeast Asia has in tourism and transportation, right? If you do not keep up, then the tourism and transportation of rest of Southeast Asia is going to overtake, and once again there will be a trade imbalance problem. And if you have a services trade imbalance problem, we have seen historically that if India faces trade imbalance problems or trade deficit, it becomes a huge issue long term for India's trade policy. So if you end up building this, allowing this trade deficit to build up, is going to actually become a political issue in the long run. So it is in the interest of both ASEAN and India to have balanced trade, which means that more exports of Indian digital services has to go to balance out for the tourism and the transportation export that is coming out of Southeast Asia. So I'll just conclude with this, which is that I think that India needs to be much more aggressive and have a sense of urgency in its digital agenda. It needs to be much more ambitious than what it is. It needs to complement it with conversations about merchandise trade, not just digital trade. And finally, it needs to diversify away from just Singapore and think about other markets and really pursue those markets in Southeast Asia as well. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhargava, for so nicely giving us a complete overview of India-ASEAN digital cooperation, highlighting some of the challenges which we are facing. Now, we still have 5-6 minutes to go, and I'm wondering if we have some comment and suggestion. I can see 2 of my colleagues in this room have their hands up, so maybe I can invite first Dr. Amit.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Pankaj. So first of all, thank you all the speakers for the fascinating presentations. It was quite a learning experience also, and since we at RIS we have been following ASEAN, so it has been quite fascinating to know the recent developments and also the challenges. My question to Professor Devasadan, Madam, you mentioned about the misalignment. So is the way out is that India should pursue this digital cooperation bilaterally with each ASEAN countries to mitigate those and address those alignment issues, regulatory issues, or shall we still have that scope of negotiating ASEAN and India level digital cooperation framework where these issues can be sorted out? So, but my hunch is that will take a little longer time. So, shall we go a bilateral way to address those issues? So, this is my one question to you, Madam. Thank you.
Dr. Dash.
Thank you, Pankaj. First of all, thank you all the panelists for complete coverage of the issues relating to the ASEAN digital cooperation. I work in the fintech and digital space to some extent. So, all of you hinted at the work needs to be done for regulation, because a lot of fragmentation exists and interoperability, as you all rightly mentioned, the beginning of that addressing that regulatory harmonization or sort of country with common denominator so that we can leverage on digitalization. But keeping the priorities of the elemental priorities of the country, the regulation will evolve at its own pace. It cannot be rushed up in a way, because the applications of digitalization still to be done in a intense way, like in agriculture, the health, education, as mentioned by Dr. Sandeep and others. So all wide spectrum of application of digital tools, digitalization, to empower people to mitigate the impediments that governments and the private sector is to face in terms of delivering the services. So leveraging on the digitalization for development assumes the purpose private. Now, while doing so, regulation is needed because regulation becomes the building block to unlock such kind of possibility. But regulation cannot be rushed off just like that because countries are also learning and catching up that where they fail. So all these regulatory misalignment or the new challenges the countries are facing will be understood when they try to leverage capitalization in various spectrums of the socio-economic domains. So my question to all of you, whoever can pick it out, we don't have really best practices in a very big number, like UPI would be called a best practice in terms of retail payments in India. But beyond interoperability, some of those aspects were covered by Dr. Srinath. Beyond interoperability, what is that best practice you see, whether it's India, ASEAN, or elsewhere in the world, that could perhaps guide the countries in India and ASEAN countries to sort of follow as a model for the regulatory roadmap. Because what I understand in RBI, what India is doing, is the way to go. Not to sort of go in a hurry to do, going by sandbox approach, maturing the technologies, understanding the deficiency in regulation by addressing the scope of cybersecurity frauds and other things. But that may not be the case for everybody to agree with. So is there any best practice regulatory model which goes beyond interoperability or takes interoperability as the beginning of that? So to address that, that will also be helped in terms of enriching whatever it is going to be on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dash. Is there any other question? Krishna, do you have any question?
So I have one question. So thank you first of all for this event. But it's more tilted towards law. So we know that Vietnam is coming through with an AI law, saying Malaysia is also on track, and there is DEFA which will also deal with AI. So is there a chance that all of them will be aligned, or are we expecting some kind of mismatch or some kind of difference in it? Thank you.
Thank you, Krishna. So we don't seem to have any other questions. So may I request now our speaker to respond to any comment and suggestion they want to, and also make their concluding remark. We can go in the order they have spoken. So we can start with Dr. Devatsan.
Thank you for that question. I will take the first question because I could hear that. I'm so sorry. The second and third wasn't very clear. The first question, I don't believe that regulations can be done on a bilateral world, a bilateral nature. It has to be ASEAN-India. That framework needs to be established. And that is why I would propose an ASEAN-India digital economy framework with some clear actionable plans here to be implemented. So I think it cannot be done in a vacuum because with independent ASEAN member states, because you will need to streamline some of those procedures to reduce duplication, to reduce transaction costs. So just like in the goods sector, how they streamline non-tariff measures, the same would apply here in the context of digital trade. So I believe it should be definitely a region with India, with the entire region with India in terms of regulations. But in terms of projects, given the complexity of this misalignment, I would think like Singapore's different. They started with that institution, the digital payment systems and so on, and with investment and commercial linkages. But you see with Malaysia, they're even struggling with that digital payment system. So what I see is moving ahead with specific pilot projects on a bilateral basis. So the bilateral comes from the project per se, and then probably you see spillovers. So once you start, like, because Malaysia wants to be a medical device hub within Southeast Asia, anchors more than 300 of the MNCs in medical devices, big players. So it's almost there with the MDA CE is already the chair of the GH working group globally. So I think the prospects are very clear in medical devices. So I see cooperation probably on a sectoral basis. So that's what I would advocate for moving ahead with actionable projects, practical cooperation, if one would like to call it. Yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Gwal?
Thank you. The first, the common basic point was that do we need to have a comprehensive Indo-ASEAN framework, or it can be a bilateral arrangement? Now, let me come through with my RCEP background on a digital trade chapter that was being negotiated under RCEP and the challenges that were there. The bilateral countries in ASEAN region have different aspirations and different bandwidth as far as digital consumption of is concerned. The regulations inside the ASEAN region as such are quite fragmented, and the approach to such regulations are quite different. Whereas Singapore is at one end, countries like Laos, Cambodia, and others are on the opposite end as far as the internal laws and regulations are concerned, and as well as their appetite to participate in a digital trade ecosystem. So what I believe is that the bilateral arrangements can be possible. India, Singapore already have a e-commerce agreement of 2002, which can be upgraded, as Madam already said in her initial remarks, to make it modern. But what I believe is that India, ASEAN need to move fast. Regulations cannot be the stumbling blocks or agreement or negotiation. There can be some low-lying fruits that can be agreed on to enable this trade, which can be agreement on cross-border data flows, agreements on paperless trading, which can be easily negotiated and moved on fast, which can be actually negotiated. There can be an initial agreement between the ASEAN players and India, and the detailing of a comprehensive framework can take time, and which will, but what is required is that India-ASEAN digital cooperation should move at an unprecedented pace at right now, looking at the world geopolitical fragmentation and opportunities which it throws for both the India and ASEAN both. And that's my take. And so that's, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Srinivas, your final thoughts?
Yeah. I would like to take Dr. Dash's query. Like, while interoperability could be the point that we have emphasized the most in the presentation. So his question was, what could be beyond interoperability, and what could be the ways in which are the different forms in which the cooperation could be further manifested. So therefore, there could be multiple ways in which we can manifest the cooperation. One could be what I can call it as the mutual recognition, which need not necessarily be the interoperability. You need not actually do always interoperable exchanges, but a mutual recognition of some of the standards across these nations. For example, when we talk about the data localization principles, when we talk about privacy enhancing technologies, when we talk about digital signatures that come, you need not necessarily have an interoperability, but if we can have a framework through which our standards are recognized by the other countries and their standards are recognized by us, and if we have that frequent exchanges of standards testing and then used as a kind of acceptable standards for the other country purposes, even that could be one area to start focusing upon. There could be pilot projects actually, apart from interoperability. What could be the joint pilot projects, like the way the CBDC corridors that we are talking about? One is the Project Nexus, is basically at a fast payment integration, fast payment system integration. But there could be also CBDC project corridors in terms of how each individual countries can interact with other countries' central banks and the digital currency pilot projects that we can try to see. That will give an opportunity for shared learning and also the shared challenges actually. And third, in the current domain of cyber security, doing a kind of a cyber security drills from the other nations, it could be also a kind of a good enough perspective, because a nation could be a little complacent if we are going to do a self-assessment of our own cybersecurity competences and preparedness actually. So occasionally it would be useful if we can invite maybe the external assessors or evaluators in terms of understanding how our preparedness rates against their particular standards, for example. Such kind of a mutual drills could be one good example. Are the technical capacity building, especially in the wake of the things like post-quantum computing that is happening, the generative AI. We are not in the phase of interoperability or anywhere near to even talking about legal recognitions here. We are still in the process of learning what could be the implications. So the technical capacity is basically what are the sort of innovations that are happening in one country that could be exchanged as a kind of a technical workshop with other countries, because if we have seen the recent Mythos incident that has happened, and how many countries maybe from ASEAN or India region have been asked to participate in Project Glassweek, for example. So such kind of questions, if we ask ourselves, then there is a forum that needs to be there for the people from ASEAN and India to jointly host this technical capacity workshop and share the learning. And last one is, I think, the most important thing, if we have to sow the seeds, the educational certifications and the equivalency principles as a joint certification programs, which is basically, I have seen recently when I have visited Netherlands, for example, the European Union Horizons project, 2030 Horizons project. In fact, they have got a very beautifully curated program on a latest technology, neurotechnology. The way in which the program works is a home university can start the basic courses, and then there will be two other partner universities which can give one semester training. This way, a student can get exposed to the multitude of countries and the practices in the different countries while basing themselves as a domicility in terms of certification of a particular home institution. I think for the next generation, if we have to really get that people-to-people exchange or a technical capacity, or need to understand the countries more, a joint or maybe a kind of a collaborative educational certification programs is also another way to go. So interoperability is one aspect of very technical or a niche or a mature-ish kind of a cooperation. But below that, we have got a lot of these foundational things we still need to work upon. I hope this adds some value to the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivas. Dr. Bhardwaj, any final thought?
I'll just be very quick, and I will also have a very non-technical approach to this, which is stark contrast to what has been discussed so far. About the approach from bilateral, like the choice between bilateral and multilateral. And of course, many times diplomatically is much more feasible and much more expedient to do things bilaterally, right? I mean, it just makes life easier. But there are, I think, three basic reasons to think about why India should still, it is worth India to put effort in trying to make an ASEAN solution rather than bilateral solution. Number one is that it is in India's political interest to keep ASEAN as a vibrant organization. What it doesn't want is a fragmentation in Southeast Asia where every country is on its own, and then there are all sorts of political and economic pressures that they are faced with, which otherwise they won't if they are collectively together as an ASEAN. So strengthening ASEAN is directly in the interest of India, right? And it goes in all directions, whichever way you want to approach it. The second is that a lot of smaller countries, something that Dr. Garg was already mentioning, right? That a lot of countries which have limited state capacity, like Laos, Cambodia, they feel much more comfortable engaging with a country like ASEAN, a country like India through ASEAN, rather than on one-on-one, where they feel a little bit outgunned, right? So it becomes, that is also one of the reasons. And the third is that if you decide that, hey, listen, ASEAN is too difficult, let's just do bilateral, what ends up happening, which is what is happening right now, that you end up with just Singapore, a little bit of Malaysia, and that is it, right? You just are too focused on the easiest of the pickings, which is in case of say Singapore becomes very easy because Singapore just does all the work for you, right? And has actually in some ways has greater administrative capacity in terms of negotiating with India on some specific aspects, right? So and then it becomes Singapore's agenda rather than India's agenda, right? And so much of this approach of like, because ASEAN is too tough, let's just do bilateral, ends up resulting in that it is just too focused on one or two or three countries in the Southeast Asia, and rest of the countries are ignored. So that is, I think, the arguments of why you have to think about multilateral and put a lot of stake in it. Dr. Das, I couldn't hear your question completely, but I got the sense that you basically saying that they lack best practices on an international level, and the Indian approach, why should we reconsider Indian approach? It seems like perfectly fine, and it's traditionally been very conservative in all fronts, right? The Indian position is to go slow and conservative, and it does in many ways actually has yielded dividends for India historically in many ways. However, I think that it also comes at a cost where India is just not in many rooms where a lot of new rules are being written for and international norms are being developed, and then India has to catch up to certain things which have already been done. So for example, right now this new thing about supply chain agreements that is coming up in between ASEAN countries and various East Asian countries, which has been triggered by Iran war. India's supply chain conversations are much less sophisticated than what is going on with other dyads, right? So those agreements are much more complicated. And then by the time India comes on board, it will have to basically agree to a format which has already been established because it wasn't in the room to actually force those norms. So many times staying out of these conversations basically also becomes the thing where India's approach is very divergent from the rest. And then it takes a long time to bridge the gap instead of, you being in the room from the beginning and trying to shape it the way you want it to be shaped. So I'll just end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Bhardwaj. So I think we have had a wonderful panel discussion followed by very interesting questions. So I won't go and summarize what we have discussed over the last 2 hours or so. But if I have to kind of point out 2 or 3 main things, then one thing is very clear that the policy fragmentations remains a key challenge in creating barriers to seamless border and digital activity. So this policy fragmentation is a real challenge. And if I'm not wrong, one of the key message of the discussion is that the most practical way forward is the interoperability. Rather than interoperability and regulatory compatibility rather than complete harmonization. And another aspect which I think all the panelists have highlighted is that the focus should shift towards more practical cooperation in high priority sectors. It may include data protection, cybersecurity, AI, for India, DPI, fintech, etc. So if I have to kind of close in one sentence, then I would like to say the challenge is to move from fragmented digital policies towards interoperable digital ecosystem and from dialogue towards practical cooperation. So thank you very much. I would like to thank all the panelists as well as the people who have intervened from the floor. I'm also grateful to ISES for joining us. We will be kind of putting together a report based upon discussion, and we'll be sharing it with you in due course. Now, I would like to hand it over back to the MC of today's events. Over to you, Ms. Briganika.
Thank you, Dr. Vashisht, and thank you to all the panelists. May I now invite Dr. Amithendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, to deliver the closing remarks. Dr. Palit, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mriganika. And I think I'll just mention 2 points at the outset as we bring this conversation to a close. In the beginning, what Professor Iqbal Singh Sivia from ISAS and Professor Sachin Sharma mentioned from RIS, this initiative of today began from a conversation that we had at the RIS between ISAS and us roughly 3 months ago. And I think it's quite remarkable that we have been able to pull off this initiative within a short period of time. When we wanted to pick up this subject for mutual engagement, we were really not thinking of providing solutions. Rather, we were more interested in understanding the question of digital connectivity much more deeply in a nuanced manner, especially in the context of a large number of changes that are taking place around us. Many of which we have internalized to, many of which we are still in the process of absorbing as far as the regulatory evolutions are concerned. But I think the lesson to be taken from today's event is that we are at the beginning of a very promising and at the same time challenging exercise ahead, because digital connectivity is going to be non-negotiable in a world that we are living in and will live in the foreseeable future. And it is up to all the stakeholders from India and ASEAN to effectively focus on the way forward in this regard. This is something which is really not an issue that can be overlooked either from the policy perspective or from the operational perspective. That is a lesson which we should take to heart. And I think from both RIS and ISAS, we will stay committed to this subject. And please be with us when we go forward in the next phase of this program. It's a very pleasant duty for me to thank everybody that has been involved with this initiative, and very specifically the two heads of institutes, Professor Iqbal Singh Sivia, Director ISAS, Professor Sachin Sharma, DG RIS, the panelists, Professor Evelyn Devdasan, Dr. Ajay Garg, Professor Srinivas Yanamandra, Dr. Sandeep Bharadaj from ISAS, my former colleague of many years ago and my old friend, Dr. Pankaj Vashisht. Thank you so much, Pankaj, for putting this together. And also, thanks so much to my friends from the ASEAN-India Center, Ms. Bhattacharya, consultant over there, my own colleague, Mriganika Singh Tanwar, over here at ISAS, and of course, the event support provided by my colleague Jordan and other colleagues who have been engaged in this operation. I hope we haven't kept you too far away from lunch in Delhi. And I think there's enough food for thought that is available with you. Unfortunately, we cannot join you for the lunch from here, but we hope to do that sometime in the future. Wish you all the very best. Wish you a very, very good day and a good week ahead. And as Pankaj mentioned, we are going to bring out a report of the conversation, and we hope to stay in touch. All the very best. Thank you so much. I think with that, we formally conclude the proceedings today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.